Far to the north, beyond mountains and rivers that few maps ever properly captured, there lies a wide and quiet grassland known as the Mongolian steppe. Long before cities rose there, before roads or borders, the wind moved freely across that open land, carrying with it the slow, patient rhythm of a way of life that had not changed for many centuries. Under that endless sky, families moved with the seasons, following their herds across grass that stretched further than the eye could ever follow, and at night, the stars above them were so many and so bright that they seemed to form their own quiet, glowing rivers overhead. In that quiet land, there were no great cities, no towers of stone, only clusters of round white tents scattered gently across the grass, moving from valley to valley as the seasons required. Children grew up learning the names of rivers before they learned the names of kings, and the passage of time was measured not in years written on paper, but in the slow turning of seasons, in the birth of foals in spring, in the long golden light of late summer evenings, in the first soft snow that always seemed to arrive just as the grass began to fade. It was here, sometime around the year 1162, that a boy was born near the gentle bends of the Onan River. His parents named him Temujin, a name that simply meant, of iron, though at the time, no one could have known just how fitting that name would one day become. He was born into a small family, part of a minor clan, living the same way countless generations before them had lived. Following the herds, moving with the seasons, sleeping beneath felt tents called jairs as the stars turned slowly overhead. The rivers were cold and clear, the winters long and heavy with snow, and the summers short but golden, filled with the soft sound of grass moving in the wind. When Temujin was still very young, only about 9 years old, his father was poisoned by rivals from a neighboring tribe. It was a quiet, almost invisible tragedy, the kind that happened often on the steppe, where power could shift as easily and silently as the wind changes direction. With their protector gone, the wider clan chose not to protect the widow and her children. And so Temujin's mother, a woman named Holun, was left alone with her young family, with no horses, no herds, and no one to turn to. She gathered her children close and did what mothers on the steppe have always done in hard times. She endured, quietly, patiently, one long season after another. Some nights, when the wind was gentle and the sky especially clear, Holun would sit quietly with her children outside the tent, pointing out the slow drift of stars, telling them softly that even the hardest winters eventually give way to spring, that patience, more than strength, was often what carried a family safely from one season into the next. For a long while, they lived a simple, hard life. Gathering roots, catching fish, hunting small animals like marmots, doing the kind of quiet, humble work that a noble family was not expected to do. There was no anger in this, only necessity. The world simply asked more of them than it usually asked of others, and they answered, slowly, patiently, the way grass bends but does not break beneath heavy snow. Even in this hardship, there was a kind of gentle rhythm to their days. Rising with the light, working until the light faded, resting beneath the same wide sky that had watched over their family for generations. As the years passed, Temujin grew older, and the hardships of his childhood settled into him not as bitterness, but as quiet determination. There were difficult years, years of capture, years of escape, years of learning who could be trusted and who could not. At one point he was taken by rivals and held for a time, a wooden collar placed around his neck to mark him as a prisoner. But he found his way free again, as he always seemed to, slipping quietly into a river at night, hiding beneath the surface with only his face above the water, waiting patiently in the darkness until his captors had given up their search. Then, just as quietly, he slipped back into the vast, forgiving landscape that had raised him. Eventually, Temujin married a woman named Borte, someone he had known since childhood, and their bond became one of the steady threads that held his early life together. Their life together was simple, built around small comforts, a warm fire on a cold evening, the quiet company of family, the steady presence of someone who had chosen to stay through every hardship. It was not a grand or dramatic love, but a patient one, the kind that grows slowly over many quiet years, much like the grass that returns, gently and without announcement, every single spring. He also formed a deep friendship with a young man named Jamuka, and for a time, the two of them were closer than brothers, riding together, hunting together, sharing the long, quiet nights of the steppe beneath skies full of stars. They would sit by low fires late into the evening, speaking softly of the kind of life they hoped to build, unaware of how differently their paths would one day unfold. Slowly, almost without anyone noticing at first, Temujin began to gather people around him. He was not the strongest warrior on the steppe, nor the richest. But he had a rare kind of patience, and an even rarer idea, that loyalty and skill should matter more than birth, more than which clan a person happened to be born into. People who had once served against him were welcomed into his circle if they proved faithful. Slowly, tribe by tribe, alliance by alliance, the scattered and often quarreling peoples of the steppe began to gather beneath him, the way scattered clouds slowly gather before a long, gentle rain. It happened gradually, almost without notice, the way a single stream, joined quietly by others along its path, can slowly become a wide and steady river, carrying far more than anyone would have guessed from its small and humble beginning. There were difficult seasons still ahead. Old friendships tested, old loyalties broken, and slow, careful choices made beneath the weight of responsibility. Jamuka, once his closest companion, eventually became his rival, and their paths, once so closely joined, drifted quietly apart, the way two rivers that once ran side by side can slowly bend in different directions, carried by forces neither one fully controls. In the year 1206, on the wide grassy plains where so much of his life had unfolded, the many tribes of Mongolia came together for a great and solemn gathering. And there, beneath the open sky he had known since childhood, Temujin was given a new name. They called him Genghis Khan, meaning something like universal ruler. It was the quiet culmination of a life that had begun in loss, and had slowly, steadily, grown into something far larger than anyone could have predicted. The gathering was not loud or chaotic, but solemn, the kind of quiet ceremony that carries more weight in its silence than any celebration could in its noise. The gathering itself unfolded slowly, the way important moments on the steppe often did. Elders spoke in low, measured voices. Banners made of horsehair swayed gently in the wind above the crowd. There was feasting, but even the feasting was calm, shared bowls of warm milk tea, quiet toasts, long pauses where nothing needed to be said at all, because everyone present understood the weight of what was happening without needing to hear it spoken aloud. Under this new unity, life on the steppe began to change. Old rivalries that had divided the Mongol peoples for generations began to fade, replaced by a shared sense of belonging. Laws were written down, carefully, so that fairness might outlast any single ruler's lifetime. Trade routes, once dangerous and unpredictable, became safer, allowing merchants and travelers to move more freely across long distances than they ever had before. Messengers could now cross vast stretches of land under the protection of a single, unified authority, carrying news and goods between places that had once felt impossibly far apart. In the years that followed, the influence of this unified Mongol nation began to reach further outward, touching lands in China, in Central Asia, in Persia, and eventually stretching all the way toward the edges of Europe. Cities that had stood for centuries encountered a force unlike any they had known before, and the map of the known world began to shift, slowly and permanently, in ways that would be felt for generations. Great trading cities such as Bukhara and Samarkand, once known for their libraries and gardens, their scholars, and their quiet courtyards, were drawn into the sweep of this vast historical change. By the time Genghis Khan passed away in the year 1227, resting at last after a long and difficult life, the foundations he had laid stretched across much of Asia. In the years after his death, his descendants would carry that foundation even further, into Russia, into Eastern Europe, into the Middle East, creating what would eventually become the largest connected land empire the world has ever known, an empire built not just on conquest, but on the quiet, patient unity that had first been forged among scattered tribes on a windswept plain. Caravans that once traveled in fear now moved slowly and safely along well-worn paths, carrying silk, spices, and quiet news between distant lands. Cities that had never heard of one another began, slowly, to learn each other's names. Scholars, artisans, and travelers crossed vast distances under a single, unbroken peace, and for a time, the long roads between east and west grew calmer than they had ever been before, carrying not just goods, but ideas, drifting quietly from one horizon to another like seeds carried gently on a steady wind. And yet, if you trace the story all the way back, past the empire, past the armies, past the great gathering on the plains, you find only a small boy by a quiet river, left with nothing, learning slowly, patiently, how to survive. Perhaps that is the gentlest way to remember him, not as a conqueror, but as someone who once had very little, and who, with time and quiet persistence, built something the world had never quite seen before. Every great and sweeping story, in the end, begins with a single small moment, easy to overlook, waiting patiently to unfold. The wind still moves across that same grassland tonight, the way it always has, carrying with it the same slow, patient rhythm it carried 800 years ago. The rivers still bend the same way, the grass still moves gently beneath the same wide sky, and somewhere in that quiet, endless landscape, the story continues to rest, softly, the way old stories often do, waiting patiently for someone new to listen, and for the night to grow a little deeper, and a little quieter, until sleep finally comes. If you close your eyes now, you might almost imagine it. The low hum of wind moving across open grass, the distant, gentle sound of horses shifting quietly in the dark, the soft crackle of a dying fire beneath a sky so full of stars it seems endless. It is a peaceful place to rest tonight, far from noise, far from hurry, held only by the same slow rhythm that has carried this story, quietly, patiently, for 800 years, and will carry it, just as gently, into whatever comes next.